Welcome to BIV Today, the daily podcast from the Newsroom of Business in Vancouver. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief. Well, Justin Trudeau was in British Columbia last week for what looked suspiciously like election campaigning. The country's worst-kept political secret is that in a matter of weeks, we're going to be thrust into a federal election, even though there's no particular threat of the minority government failing to have its way in the House of Commons. This week, though, the leader of the opposition is out in British Columbia, too, for some in-person events. The easing of restrictions in the pandemic is making it possible to have public gatherings with limited capacity, and Conservative leader Erin is doing exactly that. I have him on Zoom, though, today, but at least you're in the same time zone as we're doing this. Good to see you.
It's great to see you, Kirk, and it's great to be in British Columbia.
Yeah, I have to start with what public opinion research is saying is a bit of a gulf between the popularity of the party and your own standing in this one. What is it, do you think, Mr. O'Toole, that Canadians aren't understanding about you?
Well, most Canadians don't know me, and that's a challenge, no question. But it's also an opportunity because in the next election, there's really only one choice. There's a leader that actually has real-world experience in the private sector, that has cabinet experience, that served in the military, including training and being here in British Columbia during my Air Force career, who's proud of the jobs here in BC, one of the only people standing up for workers in Kitimat in the softwood lumber industry. So as people get to know me, get to know my own background, I'm ethical. I'm a big tent conservative with a strong voting record on rights and other things for Canadians. And I think very quickly people will see there's a real positive option after the phoniness and, quite frankly, the corruption of Justin Trudeau, someone who's broken ethics rules 3+ times. It's time for a restoring of trust in our federal government and in our national institutions.
But it still speaks to something that's going on here, which is that there must be some worries about you, some apprehensions about you, that people maybe who have a bit of an understanding of you have a bit of a concern. What do you think Canadians need not worry about with you?
Well, we know it's people don't know me. And in the last year, the focus on COVID, Mr. Trudeau wouldn't even show up in Parliament. They tried to shut down Parliament. It's been hard for me to get the message out. But I think people will have to know that I'm a pro-choice MP. I've got a stronger voting record on LGBTQ issues than Mr. Trudeau does, to be honest. And I will make Indigenous reconciliation central to our government. It was my first question in the House of Commons as opposition leader, was on a call to action, one of the 94 that was ignored by Mr. Trudeau, despite the positive rhetoric before he became Prime Minister. I worked on some of the issues with Indigenous businesses pro bono as a lawyer before I got into politics. So I'm a roll up the sleeves guy that I think a lot of folks in BC would realize when they meet me, they'd love to have a beer, and I'd love to have a craft beer from BC with them. And so that's what we need, real people in politics again, delivering, not the phony sort of press release, photo op driven stuff that even we've seen from Mr. Trudeau this week.
So on the basis then of what it is that you're detecting are the perceptions of you and the real feelings about you, what would a campaign, in your view, look like in terms of your own personal emphasis? What is it that you need to do, do you think, to get what you consider to be an accurate impression of yourself into the minds of Canadian voters?
Well, I look at the election as an opportunity, Kirk, for me to actually meet most Canadian voters. Most Canadian voters will acknowledge they don't know much about the Conservative leader. Why is that? Well, I'm not a celebrity. Mr. Trudeau, his name was Justin Smith, would probably not be Prime Minister of this country. My experience before politics, I think, is probably critical for our country that's divided, that saw $160 billion worth of jobs and investment leave Canada before COVID, that is diminished on the world stage. The US is raising softwood lumber tariffs, not eliminating them with the Biden administration. So they're going to see with me, as they get to know me, someone that brings people together, that builds a team and accomplishes things. I did that, Kirk, as a new veterans minister when I helped resolve the class action lawsuit brought by BC veterans, the Equitas case. People that had lost such faith in the Conservative government my approach of building a team, building trust, help resolve some of those things. And those veterans I now consider friends. So that's my style. And I think that's part of the reason Mr. Trudeau is going to try and pull the rug or the wool over people's eyes. The country's not even fully open, and he's already putting his political skin forward. He doesn't want people to really get to know me. So it's a challenge, Kirk, but it's also an immense opportunity. And I think the $500 billion of debt that's put on, the rising inflation, the housing crisis, the opioid crisis, the division, the sort of decline in discourse, it's time for fresh leadership. And that's what I'm going to be offering.
Yeah. What's the nastiest thing you think he could say about you?
Well, in my first few months, they started attacking me as some Bay Street tycoon because I worked as a corporate lawyer. Now, I wasn't even a partner. I worked long hours, and my wife and I had very modest means, and she worked for the Toronto Argonauts. I articled and worked for a large corporate law firm. And in my spare time, I raised funds for a women's shelter. I helped start the largest charity for military families and veterans in the country. I'm a doer. Mr. Trudeau was given immense possibilities and really sort of meandered his way through life. And so I think they've already attacked me for that private sector experience. But I'll tell you, I know that budgets don't balance themselves. I know that you have to be tough on the world stage to negotiate good trade access. You have to be taken seriously. You have to take China and the rise of communist China seriously. Mr. Trudeau's asleep at the switch, and Canada's in decline. It's time for a turnaround operation, and that's what our recovery plan is going to offer.
So you alluded to his trip out here, and when he came out, he put a fair number of dollars, he committed a fair number of dollars far into the future, not right away, but far into the future bet on kind of two things. One, childcare, two, public transit. Those were his big ticket items. If you were in his shoes, which two items would you choose?
Well, focusing on what you said, Kirk, money way out in the horizon. Mr. Trudeau cannot be trusted on anything. The Liberal Party has promised a national daycare program 9 times. Even cats only get 9 lives, Kirk. So there was no consultation. I agree with the provinces. We need more options for families. We're going to give more options, more flexibility, a plan that will actually work, as opposed to a magical plan promised for the 9th time 5+ years from now. We announced the extension of the SkyTrain from Surrey to Langley before Mr. Trudeau because of my 24 virtual meetings with chambers. I know that we have to partner on local, municipal, and provincial priorities on everything from transit to building resiliency for climate change as part of an environmental program. I was talking about that today in Richmond. So I think British Columbians have to realize Mr. Trudeau comes out here, makes some vague references to the importance of British Columbia for him. I will deliver. And I think you need only ask one retiring British Columbia MP whether Mr. Trudeau is sincere and delivers, and that's Jody Wilson-Raybould. And I think people need to realize that even people that had great hope in Mr. Trudeau have found him failing and wanting ethically.
So I didn't hear you, though, identify a couple of things that would be your arsenal in this, because he presumably has some research that says these are a couple of things that strike the chord properly. He clearly wants to get into your nest there in Surrey with more MPs, and he clearly believes that there's something there in the way of a winnable strategy with childcare. What do we say are your two big ones here?
Well, we have a 5-point recovery plan. As I said, 1 million jobs in 1 year, eliminating the ideological barriers to employment Mr. Trudeau's brought in, negotiating a softwood lumber agreement, a targeted program for small businesses in crisis. We proposed, Kirk, a safe and secure reopening that would have saved the tourism business in British Columbia, particularly with the Alaska cruise ships. Mr. Trudeau's asleep at the switch, including on a safe and effective reopening. We have a plan for accountability, a national mental health action plan, securing capacity, including supporting key industries, including those here in British Columbia, and a plan to get back to fiscal balance. That's what British Columbians want. They actually want certainty for the employment situation so that we can tackle the housing crisis. Another empty promise from Mr. Trudeau. And right now, they're seeing a choice of a Liberal government that promises things but never delivers, from drinking water on reserve right through to daycare, or a team led by myself and the Conservative Party that has an action plan for the economy and regaining the Asia Pacific foothold that the Lower Mainland and that British Columbia really represents. That the decline in our relations with India and other countries hurts trade through here. So there's going to be a key role for British Columbia in our economic recovery, which we will drive. That's the top issue coming out of COVID, with the highest unemployment in the G7 or next to it, and $500 billion in new debt. We need an action plan for our economy.
So I think your party has 17 of the 42 seats out here in British Columbia, if I'm not mistaken, but there's nothing in either the largest city, ours here in Vancouver, or Victoria. I mean, let's kind of leave Victoria aside because it has a historic past that we hear with it that I think has not been all that friendly to the Conservatives. But Vancouver has had. Vancouver used to be a real fight for this party. So what is it that you think has happened here that the party has lost its way in this city?
Well, we're having great candidates step up, and we are going to be winning more seats in the Lower Mainland and on the island. And part of it is reestablishing trust on a few issues that I've said as leader I wanted to do. That's why in March, I launched our climate change plan. Some people didn't think we were taking it seriously enough in the past. So our team worked with actually an agency based out of Vancouver to come up with the most comprehensive pre-election plan in Canadian history. It's better than the Liberal plan, so much so that Mr. Wilkinson and Mr. Trudeau have tripped through changing their own targets twice, 7 days after I launched my plan, with no explanation how they'll make it. So we know that climate change is an area where we didn't meet the trust sufficient for folks. I was disappointed. I wanted us to do a little more. And now as leader, I'm going to be able to make sure that that's part of it. I do think as well that growing our tent, some new cultural communities, the LGBTQ community, which, as you know, I've already spoken about. I want anyone that's worried about the division in this country, the debt, the sort of drift in Ottawa, the corruption around Mr. Trudeau, multiple ethical scandals, cover-ups. They're suing the speaker, Kirk, to keep cover-ups growing in Parliament. It's unprecedented. People haven't been seeing it because of COVID, but in the election, I will focus in on the fact that we don't need more of the same for Mr. Trudeau and his enablers. Mr. Singh is his enabler. We need a plan to get people working, and I want more people seeing themselves welcome in our party, and that's something I'm going to work very hard to do.
You took a very different style initially as a leader, Mr. O'Toole, because you were on record as saying that Conservatives can't continue to wait for Canadians to come around to their positions on issues. So I want to know, what would you say, though, is the one issue you've come around on to the position of Canadians?
Well, I think one position that I have changed my view over the course of my public life is the role of unions in setting the agenda for our economy, making sure they have a seat at the table from everything to the trade tribunal and some of the sectors in our country that have been left behind by globalization. Now, I always had respect for working people because I grew up in an auto community. I saw the importance of unions. But the Conservatives, I came into a party we had a track record of fighting with the leaders. Many of their members would vote for us, but we were always squabbling. And we had some bills that upset members of the labor movement. So I've probably come around most on that because I've built great relationships within the labor movement, particularly the power workers and the IESO, the electrical workers. And so that's something that I'm reflecting in our party. I want us to partner with labor to build opportunities for their members. And I say to union leaders, part of building trust, I've spoken to more union leaders than most Canadians in the last 6 to 8 months. And part of it is I say, I want you to have my trust because I want your members to have opportunity. I realize global trade has been gamed by some bad actors to the detriment of Canada. And right now, I can't stress it enough. You know, before the COVID crisis, the illegal rail blockades, the so-called shut down Canada movement, The NDP was supporting that. They've totally abandoned working people. Mr. Singh and the federal NDP have no connection with folks that have to work hard, roll up their sleeves for a living. And I'm going to fight for them. And I feel that we're really the only option for those people that want a future for both themselves and their children.
So you speak of this issue, and of course, I don't doubt for a second this is a very hard sell for the Conservative Party, and also a hard sell for unions, that you can somehow align somehow. Was there an episode? Was there a revelation, an epiphany that you had at one point where you thought, we have to stop, being hard on each other on this one. We need an alliance here.
Yeah, for me, it was years ago. And I'll tell you, it was a union leader named Don McKinnon with the power workers, because I'm a big supporter of nuclear power because it's emission free. And I think small modular reactors, and of course, Ontario, we got rid of coal because we got our generating from nuclear back on track. And I was always working with Don and the power workers on public education and the importance of a mixed supply chain for electricity and getting emissions down. I've been talking about it in the environment for many years. And Don and I were always on the same page, except for when it came to one or two bills that we were putting through that they viewed as a tax on the secret ballot for unions and the internal affairs of union. I kind of said, yeah, why are we battling? Because we're the only ones fighting, for your party and for the jobs your members have. And so I was changing my views many years ago, in part because I saw there was so much in common. And in fact, a lot of the union members in my riding vote for me and would always say, why do you guys fight with our union leaders when we vote for you? And I think BC has had an interesting situation where you see some provincially people vote NDP, but federally have voted Conservative or even Alliance or Reform in the past because of that connection with working people and the shared view that the Liberals only do things for the wealthy few and the well-connected. And Mr. Trudeau has proven that from SNC Lavalin to the We Charity. So as you said, some of my meetings, we hit it off right away. Others, there's some skepticism and we build trust. And I'll tell you, almost every meeting has ended positively. And so I think you're going to see a bit of a sea change in the next election because, as I said, Mr. Singh is more interested in protest culture and other things. He's completely abandoned working families.
So I've been in this field for about 4 decades now, and I cannot recall any Conservative opposition leader who hasn't promised to take funds away from the CBC. Right? The largest cut took place, of course, under a Liberal government, under Paul Martin. Would you really cut CBC funding?
I want to modernize the CBC because I actually think it's undermined the private sector at a time that the print to digital editions and advertising has been falling apart. Traditional media, with the exception maybe of radio, has had a real challenge in the modern advertising landscape. So we need to equalize the playing field with the US giants, not by attacking free speech and regulating people's social media like Mr. Trudeau's tried with C10, but we have to recognize that the playing field needs to be equalized. And why should CBC Digital, which Mr. Trudeau expanded by $600 million, English TV and digital, be taking away advertising? Why do they have banner ads, Kirk, when the province and all the various chains across the country are struggling to survive? So much so that Mr. Trudeau has given them a bailout fund. So I think the CBC is an important institution, particularly where it doesn't compete. I listen to CBC radio. There's no commercials, as you know. So certain parts of it have stuck with its public mandate. Other parts of it try and turn into a multimedia universe and really undermine our private sector that has a hard time adjusting. So I look at it as modernization, that if you don't put it there, any bureaucracy will just grow and increase their mandate and start competing. And I think it's unfair for the state to sponsor competition with sectors of the Canadian economy, jobs that are struggling in this new digital world. And I think most Canadians agree. My children, Kirk, do not watch television. They watch YouTube or they stream. So it's time for us to wake up and have a serious conversation on this.
Sounds like what you're promoting, though, is something like an ad-free CBC that would maybe not go everywhere that the audience is, which is today online. As you say, your children are streaming. Your children are obviously online. My guess is that they have, all kinds of social media access and things like that. And yet that's what the CBC is trying to do. And we can go into the weeds on this one, but I want to conclude though with something that is even closer to home. I mean, you had to be an idiot in this business to not make a lot of money as an owner a generation ago, and now you have to be a genius in order to make any, right? And yet you're against the government's support of local and regional and national journalism through organizations. You don't think that the 600 million plus is a very good use of funds. But what I wonder about, I mean, because I think this leads some to conclude that perhaps preserving or enhancing local journalism isn't a priority for you in this country for our identity. How do you think the finances can be fixed, if not with some form of public support?
There's a lot of ways to do it without Mr. Trudeau picking a panel who will then choose winners and losers, Kirk. So it's about being creative. We're looking at what France and Australia have done with respect to news and the web giants. Again, Mr. Trudeau promised some clarity on this, and we got C10, which was a disaster, which attack on free speech and didn't even pass. We are in favor of that. There's also innovative funding models that some are looking in terms of how they establish themselves as foundations or how subscription rates are treated. There's a whole range of things that could be looked at. The Tax Act on how advertising is treated in terms of the spend for online American sources and Canadian. So we want that to be preserved, but not through a government-directed bailout fund. Government doesn't do anything well, in my view, if it's about innovating. And this is about innovating to meet the new need of advertising and consumer interface. And I don't think it's appropriate for the state-owned broadcaster to be an extra complication in some of these spaces. So as you said, preserving the public broadcaster in that public interest domain, maybe even having them do it more effectively. I used to think that CBC International was something that was dropped because they were getting into more TV and non, nation building things. And so I think it's time to have a bit of a shakeup. The world has changed, and government can't do things like it was done in the 70s and 80s for the sake of it. But yeah, journalism is important. And I think having that independence, though, which the fund Mr. Trudeau created, that independence is being eroded. So it's also ethically wrong from a journalistic standpoint, too.
So you'd commit to some kind of framework, though, that would, through tax treatment or any number of things, would enable journalism organizations to perhaps foster that kind of independence.
Yes, as I said, we've been actually looking out and consulting widely with media to hear their opinions. And obviously, they've been looking at what Australia is doing in terms of Facebook and the web giants. So we want to get thoughtful, smart policy that is building a secure future for Canada in the future, including media and important journalism, but doing things just with one big ticket government solution, I think is actually obviously the wrong way. It often creates more unintended problems than solutions.
All right, so my self-preservation's out of the way here. My last question to you is a question that I ask a lot of people in this area, because I have a pretty good idea of what kind of a toll this takes on you physically, emotionally, what it does to your overall system. So how are you exercising self-care right now?
That's a great question, Kirk. And in fact, I ran into someone on the plane, a judge who just said, be well, you're going to be going into a busy time. My biggest thing for me is running. And I try and get it in both for the physical and the mental. When I run, I will go through some of the challenges we're facing, and I'm an optimist. I'm always trying to think of solutions and take back meetings. I met with Indigenous leaders in Alberta. I thought about that on my run this morning before I left Calgary. I'll be doing the same here in the Lower Mainland, the beautiful run in Stanley Park and other places that are favorite haunts for me. So that's how I try and get the balance. And I do try and have some downtime with my wife and children, where I'll put my phone in 5 different rooms for me so that it's nowhere near me. And my team will often put some Sunday dinners and things off limits. And that's also great for the family's wellness too. So thank you for asking. And I hope coming out of COVID, everyone needs their own wellness piece. That's why we have mental health actually in our 5-pillar plan. It's something I've worked a lot on since my time in the military.
Yeah, well, your military experience would have helped you in the pandemic, and of course, you had your own issues to deal with, of course, in the pandemic. But my last question to you is, what do you think you've learned about yourself in the pandemic?
That's a great question. I think one thing I often thought I had a broad base of knowledge in a whole range of areas. And I found that I don't in some areas, you know, in particular Indigenous reconciliation, which was my first question as opposition leader, but I've done dozens of meetings and I've realized I know Canadian history well, and I talk often about the need to balance off our history and learn from it, not just erase it and other things. But I don't know enough about Indigenous art and culture and history. And I'm trying to weave it into what I do. So I spoke about the Musqueam First Nation today in my address at Richmond, and the wonderful art, the spinning wheel, the spinning whirl art from the Musqueam artist in Vancouver, how majestic it is and how we can learn from it by bringing many fibers together into a strong thread. I think that I tried to use that in my speech today on reconciliation, but I'm committed to learn more about it because I realize for these meetings, I don't know enough to the level I should to be Prime Minister.
Yeah. Does our history trouble you now more than it did before?
Our history has always troubled me. It wasn't until law school that I learned about residential schools, but I'm really glad that my children are learning in grade school. After the horrible Kamloops situation, I spoke to my 10-year-old son about graves and that terrible chapter. He was aware of some of it. The issue with our history is, how do we recommit to our country to ensure we learn from it and heal? And that's why I've been calling for the movement on the calls to action. But it's also why I don't want to cancel Canada Day or tear down the country if we don't love who we are. And I think that's what we have to do, is channel this trauma and this disappointment of where we've fallen horrifically short in the past, to build the better country we truly want to be. And I don't hear solutions from many of the other leaders. It's easy to identify problems. It's much harder to come up with solutions, but that's what leadership is, and that's what I'm going to try and offer. I have tried to offer that through my time as a member of Parliament, but it's important for me now, standing to be Prime Minister.
I've extended you beyond our time, but then I'll ask you one last thing about this. Do you expect to have many Indigenous candidates in this election?
We will have some, and this is something I've been working on. In fact, my last event in Calgary last night, there were several First Nation leaders there who came, and some I'd met with from the Siksika Nation and others during my visit. And I was putting them on the spot to run for us because I really do think I want to have Indigenous voices in my caucus, in my cabinet. But I do know, particularly from British Columbia, what a big decision it is for the travel, and if you have children or people in your family that you're responsible for. So I've spoken to some and encouraged, but it's a big decision. We will have some, and we're in the process of finalizing nominations now, and reconciliation will be core to what we're going to put before Canadians whenever the election comes.
Yeah. Well, look, very good chat. Thanks a lot for your time today, Mr. O'Toole.
Good to be back with you, Kirk. Thank you.
You've been watching BIV Today. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief. We'll see you again.